Margaret Calloway climbed onto that auction platform knowing exactly what she was. The woman nobody would choose. 9 brides had already been claimed. 9 men had already looked at her and looked away. And when the auctioneer called her name, someone in the crowd laughed so loud the horses flinched. Then a man with 2 grieving daughters and calloused hands stepped forward. Before we begin, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit subscribe and stay with us until the very end. The laughter started before Margaret Calloway even reached the top of the platform steps. She heard it the way you hear a storm coming. Low at first, rippling through the crowd in Sage Flat's main square, like water finding the path of least resistance. A snicker from the left, a murmur from the right, and then one man's voice cutting clean through the morning air like an axe through green wood.
Lord Almighty, they sent us a whole one, didn't they?
Margaret kept climbing. 1 step, then another. Her boots were too tight, and the wood was warped, and none of that mattered because she had promised herself on the 3-week journey from Philadelphia that she would not cry in public again. Not ever again. She had cried enough in the poorhouse. She was done with that. The platform gave her a view of the whole town square, and what she saw did not comfort her. Sage Flats, Wyoming Territory, 1878. A handful of weather-beaten storefronts, a church with a crooked steeple. Dust everywhere, thick and permanent, coating everything the same shade of disappointment. And the people, men in work clothes and women in faded calico, all of them looking up at her with a particular expression she had known her entire life. Not hatred, something worse. Amusement. 9 women had stood on this platform before her this morning. 9 women, each of them claimed within minutes.
Margaret had watched from the side of the crowd, holding her travel bag against her stomach like a shield, telling herself it meant nothing, telling herself her turn would come, telling herself that all she needed was one man willing to see past the obvious. One man. That was all. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Purvis, who sweated through his shirt collar, cleared his throat, and shuffled his papers. He had the look of a man who wanted very badly to be somewhere else. "And our final bride," he announced, with the energy of someone reading a tax notice, "is Miss Margaret Calloway, age 34, recently of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Miss Calloway is an experienced housekeeper and bookkeeper, skilled in—" "How much does she weigh?" The voice came from somewhere near the saloon. Several men laughed. Margaret fixed her eyes on the mountains in the distance, blue and permanent and indifferent to all of this. She breathed through her nose. "Miss Calloway," Purvis continued, pushing through his discomfort with professional desperation, "is in excellent health and is prepared to assist with all manner of domestic— You'd need 2 horses to get her up into the mountains." This from a different voice, younger, showing off for someone. The laughter widened. A woman near the front covered her mouth, but her eyes were bright with it. Margaret Calloway had survived a poorhouse. She had survived a husband who sold the furniture out from under her and disappeared into debt. She had survived 3 weeks in a rattling stagecoach with women who whispered about her size every time they thought she was asleep. She had survived every single morning of 34 years of being too much and not enough at the same time. She took 1 step forward to the edge of the platform. "I can hear every word you're saying," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Every single one. And I want you to know that I'm still standing here." The laughter paused, not out of shame, out of surprise. "Don't mistake my size for softness," Margaret continued, and something old and iron-hard moved through her chest. "I've kept books for a business that turned profit every year for a decade. I can preserve enough food to carry a household through a hard winter.
I can stretch $1 further than any of you have ever tried, and I do not quit." She looked out over the crowd. "So go ahead and laugh, but at least one of you is going to need what I can actually do, and that man is going to be glad he paid attention." Silence held for exactly 2 seconds. Then Clarence Dodd, standing near the front in his good coat and his city boots, started clapping slowly. 1 clap. 2. His lips were smiling, but his eyes were doing something different entirely. "Spirit," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I admire that, truly. But spirit won't milk a cow or mend a fence, darling." Several men near him laughed and nodded. "No," Margaret said, "but dishonest land deals won't last forever either, Mr. Dodd. And anyone with a head for numbers knows that." The smile on Dodd's face went thin and cold. Purvis cleared his throat violently. "Perhaps the gentleman would like a moment to. I'll take her." The voice came from the back of the crowd, and it stopped everything. Not loud, not dramatic. Just 2 words spoken with the flat certainty of a man who had already made up his mind before he opened his mouth, and was not particularly interested in discussing it. The crowd parted the way crowds part for men who carry a particular kind of stillness around them. Not the stillness of a man at rest. The stillness of a man who has been through enough that very little surprises him anymore. Elias Holt walked forward through the gap in the crowd, and Margaret watched him come. He was lean and sun-dark, somewhere close to 40, with black hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week. He wore a plain brown vest over a work shirt, dusty boots, and a hat that had been through weather. There was nothing impressive about him on the surface, nothing polished or powerful in the way Dodd was polished and powerful. What he had instead was something harder to name, a quality of weight. Like a man who had been broken at least once and had put himself back together with his own hands, and didn't much care whether you noticed. He walked up to the platform and looked at Margaret. Not up and down, not the way the other men had looked, cataloging and dismissing. He looked at her face. "Holt," Dodd's voice sharpened, "you don't need a wife. You need to settle your debts and move on. This is not the time for—" "Nobody's talking to you, Clarence." Elias didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Margaret. "Ma'am, I've got a working ranch 2 hours north of here, 600 acres. I run cattle and I grow winter wheat. The work is hard and the winters are harder." He paused. "I've also got 2 daughters. Ruth is 9 and Clara is 6. Their mother died 3 years ago." The square had gone very quiet. "I'm not going to pretend I'm looking for romance," he said, and his voice didn't waver. "I'm looking for a partner, someone capable, someone who won't break the first hard season." He looked at her steadily. "You just told a crowd of strangers that you don't quit. I need to know if that's the truth or just pride talking." Margaret Calloway looked at this man for a long moment. "It's the truth," she said. "Then I'd be glad to have you." He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded payment and handed it to Purvis without looking at him. Then he extended his hand to help Margaret down from the platform. She took it. His grip was solid and unhurried, and he didn't make any kind of show about supporting her weight. He just did it, the way he'd hold a door or pick up something heavy, simply because it needed to be done. "You're making a mistake, Holt," Dodd called after them. His voice had gone to something colder now, something with an edge underneath. "A man in your situation can't afford mistakes." Elias paused. He turned around slowly. "My situation," he said, "is none of your business, Clarence. And this woman is none of your business either. We clear?" The 2 men looked at each other for a moment that stretched. Then Elias turned back and walked Margaret toward the general store, and behind them the crowd broke into noise. Inside the store, away from the square, Margaret let out a long, careful breath and set her travel bag on the counter. "Thank you," she said, "for saying what you said out there, about not quitting."
Most people would have just, "I meant what I asked," he interrupted, not unkindly. "Was it the truth or pride?"
"Both," she said honestly. "But the truth is bigger." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close enough. Fair answer. He turned to the counter and began selecting supplies with the efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he needed. "You have everything you brought?" "Just the one bag." "We'll get you a few things before we head out." He glanced at her. "Anything you need that'll make the ranch more workable, add it to the pile. I won't question your judgment." She stared at him for a moment. In 34 years, she could count on one hand the number of times a man had said that to her. "You don't know me well enough for that yet," she said. "You kept books for a profitable business for 10 years, and you told Clarence Dodd to his face that dishonest land deals don't last." He added a sack of coffee to the counter.
"That tells me enough to start."
Margaret moved through the store carefully, selecting what was practical. Quality needles and heavy thread. Medical supplies. Seeds for cold weather crops. A good sharp knife for the kitchen. She chose nothing frivolous, nothing that couldn't justify itself with use. When she placed the last item on the pile, she found him watching her. "Turnip seeds," he observed. "They grow fast in cold soil," she said. "And 2 children need vegetables through winter." He was quiet for a moment. "Ruth won't eat turnips." "Most children won't eat them cooked plain," Margaret said. "Mash them with butter and a little salt, and they don't know the difference." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not surprise. Something more careful than surprise. "Clara might," he said. "She'll eat most things. Ruth is the problem." "How old did you say Ruth was?" 9, going on 45. "Stubborn?" "Inherited it honestly." Margaret felt something loosen very slightly in her chest. "I can work with stubborn." They loaded the supplies into the wagon he'd left at the far end of the street, and Margaret noticed the way he worked. No wasted motion. No performance. Just the clean efficiency of a man accustomed to doing things himself because no one else was available to do them. She had married a man once who could not carry a basket of laundry without expecting to be thanked for it. She loaded her share of the supplies without asking for help, and Elias Holt did not offer any unless she needed it. And he did not make a show of noticing that she didn't. They were nearly finished when boots on the boardwalk made them both look up. Dodd. Flanked by 2 men who had the flat, watchful look of men paid to stand near someone important and look threatening. "I'd like a private word, Holt." Dodd's voice had the texture of polished wood, smooth and hard underneath. "Not interested." Elias finished securing the last strap on the supply load. "It's about the water rights filing," Dodd said. "I had my lawyer look at the documents again. There are some irregularities." "There weren't any irregularities last spring," Elias said, "or the spring before that." "New review," Dodd smiled pleasantly. "Takes time to catch these things. You might want to consider accepting my offer on the North Quarter before it becomes a complicated legal situation. Court fees add up, especially for a man already carrying debt from a bad harvest year." Elias turned around slowly and looked at Dodd. "Is that a threat, Clarence?" "It's a friendly observation." "The North Quarter's not for sale," Elias said. "The ranch is not for sale. The water rights are filed, legal, and paid for." He looked at Dodd without blinking. "And if your lawyer finds another set of irregularities that weren't there before, I'll want to have a conversation with the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne about how irregularities keep appearing in documents that were previously clean." Dodd's pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "You're a stubborn man," Dodd said. "Apparently it runs in the family," Elias said, and turned back to the wagon. We're done here, Clarence. Margaret climbed up to the wagon seat and arranged her travel bag at her feet. She watched Dodd and his men walk away down the boardwalk, watched the particular set of Dodd's shoulders that told her this conversation was not finished for him, only postponed. "He wants your water rights," she said. "Has for 3 years. The North Quarter sits on underground water." Elias climbed up to the driver's seat and took the reins. "How'd you figure that?" "He mentioned the North Quarter specifically."
He didn't say the ranch, didn't say the land. He said the North Quarter. She settled herself on the seat. A man who wants land says the land. A man who wants what's under it gets specific. Elias looked at her. A real look, the kind that takes inventory. "I've been saying it for 3 years, he said quietly. "Nobody around here believed me. Thought I was being paranoid." "You weren't." "No." He clicked to the horses, and the wagon began to move. "I wasn't." They rode north out of Sage Flats, and the town fell away behind them, and Margaret Calloway did not look back at it. She had spent her whole life looking back at things she couldn't keep, and people who didn't want her. She was done with that direction. "Tell me about your daughters," she said. Elias was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who keeps important things carefully stored and has to decide what to take out. "Ruth," he said, "decided a year ago that she didn't need anyone. She's been running the household since then, cooking, cleaning, telling Clara what to do. She's 9 years old, and she moves through that house like she's carrying something 3 times her weight." "She took care of everyone when you couldn't," Margaret said. "Yes. And now she's afraid that if she lets someone else in, it means she failed." He turned to look at her. "You got that from 2 sentences?" "I got that from being a person who spent years doing the thing no one else would do, and then discovering that nobody noticed, and that the only way to survive the not being noticed was to stop needing anyone to notice." She looked at the road ahead. "She's protecting herself. That's not a character flaw. That's a very smart 9-year-old. Elias was quiet for a long moment. "And Clara?" "Clara's the one who still needs something she can't name yet," Margaret said. "The one who cries more than seems reasonable for small things, because the big thing she can't cry about is too big." The sound of the wagon wheels on the road filled the silence. "Her mother's been gone 3 years, Elias said finally. His voice was level, the way a voice gets when a man has practiced being level about something for so long it's become a kind of armor. "Clara was 3 when it happened. She doesn't really remember. She just knows something's missing. And she keeps trying to find it in things that can't give it back." "Did she like her mother's cooking?" "She doesn't remember her mother's cooking." "But she asks you to cook the same things over and over," Margaret said. "Things she heard about from Ruth." His hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Biscuits," he said quietly. "She asks for biscuits almost every morning. Her mother made them from memory. I've tried 6 different ways, and none of them are right." "Do you know if your wife used lard or butter?" He blinked. "Lard, I think. There was always lard in the kitchen." "I can work with that." She folded her hands in her lap. "It'll take a few tries, but I can work with that." He looked at her again. This time, the look lasted longer. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Margaret," she said. "Please." "Margaret," he tried the name. "Why did you really come out here? Philadelphia's a city. There's work in Philadelphia for a woman who can keep books." She considered how much of the truth to give him, and decided that a man who dealt straight deserved straight dealing. "My husband left me with nothing," she said simply. "He ran up debts for 3 years without telling me. Borrowed against property he didn't own. And when the creditors came, he disappeared and left me to answer for it. I spent 8 months in the Philadelphia Municipal Poorhouse." She watched the road. "I escaped through the laundry delivery entrance with $30 I'd sewn into my underskirt over the previous 4 months. He said nothing. I could have stayed in the city, she continued, found a position as a domestic, spent the rest of my life in someone else's house, invisible, taking up as little space as possible and hoping not to be noticed. She felt the iron thing move in her chest again, the same thing that had moved when she'd stepped to the edge of that platform. I decided I would rather be somewhere that required something real from me, something that would tell me whether I was actually strong or just too afraid to find out. And you thought Wyoming Territory was the answer to that. I thought a man who needed genuine help rather than a decoration might be a place to start. The mountains in the distance had grown larger and more defined. The road was climbing, gradually, through scrub and stone and the occasional twisted pine. I should tell you something, Elias said, about why I signed with the bride agency. All right. I didn't do it for me, he said. I'd have managed. I've been managing. He looked straight ahead. But last February, Clara got sick. Fever. Lasted 11 days. And Ruth nursed her through it, sleeping on the floor beside her bed, keeping cold compresses on her through the night, never asking for help because she didn't know how to ask anymore. His jaw tightened. I stood in the doorway of that room and watched my 9-year-old daughter keep vigil over my 6-year-old daughter because I had cattle to see to and animals to feed, and the ranch doesn't stop needing work because people get sick. Margaret said nothing. Some things deserved their space. Clara got better, he said, and when she did, Ruth came to me at dinner and asked, very calmly, like she was asking about whether there was going to be anyone to help next time, because she didn't know if she could do it again. His voice had stayed level all the way through that. The levelness of it was harder to hear than if he'd broken. I signed up the next morning, he said. Margaret looked at his hands on the reins, scarred and capable, and holding everything steady the way they probably held everything steady all the time, regardless of the cost. Mr. Holt, she said. Elias. Elias. She said it carefully. I won't pretend I know your daughters yet. I won't pretend I know this ranch, or this land, or what the winters are actually like, or whether I'm equal to any of it. She looked at him directly. But I know what it is to have no one in your corner. And I know what a 9-year-old girl looks like when she's been carrying grown woman weight for too long. He met her eyes briefly before looking back at the road. I'm not going to fail your children, she said. I cannot promise you perfect or easy or without difficulty, but I can promise you I will not quit on those girls. Not for a hard winter, not for a bad harvest, not for anything short of actual death. She looked back at the road. That's what I've got to offer. Take it or leave it. The wagon rolled through a wide curve in the road, and below them, in a valley cupped between two ridges, Margaret saw it for the first time. A farmstead, solid and undecorated. A proper barn in better repair than the house. Fields stripped bare after harvest. And two small figures standing at the fence rail, watching the wagon come. Even from this distance, she could tell which one was which. The taller one stood straight and still and watchful. The smaller one was gripping the fence rail with both hands, leaning forward. Ruth's the one on the left, Elias said. I know, Margaret said quietly. The wagon came down into the valley, and Ruth Holt did not move from her position at the fence. She watched them come with gray eyes that were her father's eyes, set in a thin, serious face that had done too much thinking for 9 years. She wore a work dress that was clean and slightly too large, and her dark hair was braided with the careful precision of someone who had taught herself to do it without help. Clara stood beside her, with both hands still on the fence rail, and her eyes were fixed on Margaret, with an expression that was not quite hope, and not quite fear, but something hovering right between the two. Elias stopped the wagon and stepped down, and both girls came through the gate, Ruth walking, Clara running. Papa!
Clara went straight to him and buried her face in his shirt, and his hand came down on top of her head with the ease of 10,000 repetitions. Ruth stopped 4 feet from the wagon and looked up at Margaret with the measuring look of a general surveying terrain before a battle. "You're bigger than I expected," she said.
"Ruth." Elias's voice carried a warning note. "It's all right," Margaret said. She climbed down from the wagon, slower than she'd have liked, and stood in front of this 9-year-old girl who had been running a household and carrying her family's grief and refusing to need anything for 3 years. She crouched down to Ruth's level. Her knees protested. She ignored them. "You're right," she said. "I am bigger than most people expect. I'm also the person who kept a boarding house profitable for 10 years, who got out of a Philadelphia poorhouse with $30 sewn into my underskirt, and who just told Clarence Dodd to his face in front of the whole town that dishonest men don't last." She looked Ruth in the eyes. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm not here to take over anything that's yours. I'm here because your father asked for help, and I said yes, and I keep my word." Ruth looked at her with those 2 old gray eyes. "Can you make biscuits?" she asked. "I can make biscuits." "Good ones? Not like Papa's. I'd need to know what your mother's tasted like." Ruth's face moved slightly, a flicker of something real under all that careful control.
"They were soft," she said, her voice dropping half a register. "And they had a brown bottom. Not burned, just brown." "Lard in the dough in a cast-iron pan," Margaret said. "Preheated before you pour." Something very small changed in Ruth Holt's face. "Maybe," Ruth said, and turned back toward the house with the dignity of someone who had given as much ground as she intended to give today. Clara had detached herself from her father and was now standing directly in front of Margaret, looking up at her with wide brown eyes. "Are you staying?" Clara asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "Forever?" "That's the plan." Clara considered this for a moment, with the grave seriousness of a 6-year-old weighing a contract. Then she reached up and took Margaret's hand in both of hers, and turned toward the house.
"I'll show you where everything is," she announced, as though this settled the matter entirely. Margaret Calloway let herself be led. Behind her, she heard Elias Holt exhale slowly, the sound of a man setting down something heavy after a very long walk. She didn't look back, but she felt it, the way you feel a door closing behind you on something cold, and in front of you, the warmth beginning, careful and uncertain and real. The ranch needed work. She could see that even now. The fence on the west side was holding together with hope and wire. The kitchen garden had been let go to weeds since the last frost. The woodpile was decent, but not what it needed to be before the heavy cold came. There was so much to do. For the first time in years, Margaret Calloway felt something she had nearly forgotten how to recognize. She felt useful. And standing in the yard of this worn and working ranch, holding the hand of a 6-year-old girl who had decided, with the absolute conviction of childhood, that she was staying forever, Margaret understood that she had not simply crossed the country for a new life. She had arrived at the only life that had ever been honestly shaped for what she actually was. The mountains stood above them, patient and enormous, watching the way mountains watch everything in this part of the world, without judgment, without surprise, simply bearing witness to the small, brave, ordinary things that people do when they finally stop running and decide to stand. Somewhere inside the house, she could hear Ruth Holt moving around the kitchen with purposeful noise, the sound of cast iron and determination, refusing to acknowledge that anything had changed, which was itself the beginning of things changing. Elias came up beside her, leading the horses toward the barn. "Tomorrow morning," he said quietly, "Dodd's man will come by. He does it every week, just rides past, watches." "I know," Margaret said. "It's going to get worse before it gets better. Most things worth keeping do,"
she said. He stopped, looked at her over the backs of the horses. "You're not afraid of him," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm afraid of a lot of things," Margaret Calloway said honestly. "But a man who uses intimidation instead of legitimate argument has already told me everything I need to know about how strong his actual position is." She looked back at him. "His actual position is weak, Elias. And I think somewhere you already knew that. You just needed someone else to see the numbers." He held her gaze for a long moment. "I'm glad you came," he said. Simple. Flat. True. "So am I," she said. And she meant it in ways she had not yet found words for. Ways that had to do with platform steps, and cold laughter, and $30 sewn into an underskirt, and all the mornings she had gotten up and kept going, when stopping would have been so much easier. She was here. She was standing. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. The biscuits were wrong the first time. Margaret knew it before she even pulled them from the cast iron. The color was right, brown on the bottom, soft on top, exactly what Ruth had described. But when she set them on the table and watched Clara pick one up and bite into it, she saw the answer in the girl's face before Clara had the chance to arrange her expression into something polite. "They're good," Clara said carefully. "But not right," Margaret said. Clara looked relieved not to have to say it. "Not exactly right." Ruth was watching from her chair with her arms folded and her chin level, the posture of someone who had been disappointed enough times that she had learned to absorb it standing up. "What was different about your mother's?" Margaret asked her directly. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember exactly," she said, and something shifted in her voice, something she quickly covered over. "I just remember they tasted like something. These taste like biscuits." Elias sat at the head of the table and said nothing, but Margaret caught the way his hands tightened briefly around his coffee cup. "All right," Margaret said. "We'll try again tomorrow." "You don't have to keep," Ruth started. "I said we'll try again tomorrow," Margaret repeated, pleasantly, with the firmness of someone who had already decided. "Eat your biscuit, Ruth. It's not right yet, but it's still food." Ruth ate her biscuit. She didn't say another word about it, but she ate the whole thing, and that was something. That first week on the Holt ranch moved the way unfamiliar work always moves. Fast and relentless, and full of things you didn't know you didn't know. Margaret was up before dawn every morning, earlier than Elias, earlier than the girls, learning the kitchen by feel in the dark. Where the good knives were, which burner ran hot, how much wood the stove needed to hold temperature through a full morning of cooking. She found the household accounts on the third day, tucked in a wooden box on the shelf above the desk in the corner of the main room. 3 years of numbers in Elias's handwriting, careful and honest, and telling a story he probably didn't realize was this visible on the page. She sat down with those accounts and a fresh candle and read them the way she had read every set of books she'd ever kept. Not looking for what was there, but for what was missing. What she found made her sit very still for a long time. The ranch was profitable. Genuinely, solidly profitable. The kind of profitable that comes from hard work and good management and knowing your land. But there were payments in the records that didn't match any purchase she could identify. Small amounts, irregular, spread out in a pattern that someone who wasn't looking for it would never notice. $2 here, $5 there. Described as fees. Described as administrative costs. Described as water maintenance. She wrote down every one of them on a separate page and added them up. Then she wrote the total down and looked at it for a while. In 3 years, Clarence Dodd had pulled $214 out of this ranch through charges that had no legitimate basis. Not enough at once to trigger a confrontation, small enough each time to seem like the ordinary cost of doing business in a territory where the man who handled all the business was also the man you had to pay. Margaret put the accounts back exactly as she had found them and went to bed. In the morning, she said nothing about it to Elias. She was not ready yet. She needed more information, and she needed to understand better what she was dealing with before she put it in front of him and watched his face do what it would do when he understood how long it had been happening. What she focused on instead was the girls. Clara was easy, or at least easier. She had made her decision about Margaret on the first day and was now executing it with the wholehearted commitment of a 6-year-old who had found something she intended to keep. She followed Margaret through the kitchen in the mornings, asking questions about everything, handing things over before being asked, narrating her own thoughts in a continuous stream that Margaret found genuinely entertaining. "Do you think turnips know they're turnips?" Clara asked one morning while Margaret was pressing the biscuit dough. "I think they know they're something," Margaret said. "What they are specifically is probably not information they need." Clara considered this very seriously. "I think if I was a turnip, I'd want to know." "Why?" "So I could be a good one," Clara said, as though this were obvious. Margaret looked down at this 6-year-old girl with her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn jaw and felt something she was not prepared to name yet settle quietly into her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. "You'd be an excellent turnip," she said. Clara beamed and handed her the rolling pin. Ruth was harder. Not unkind, not openly hostile, just very precisely careful about how much she gave and to whom. She did her work without being asked. She kept her room in a state of order that would have impressed a military officer. She spoke to Margaret politely, answered direct questions directly, and never once asked for anything. It was the not asking that broke Margaret's heart in a slow, quiet way. On the 5th evening, Margaret found her sitting on the porch after supper, mending a tear in one of Clara's dresses in the last of the daylight. Her stitches were small and even, and completely correct. The work of a child who had been forced to teach herself adult competence with no one to tell her when she'd gotten it right. Margaret sat down beside her. Not close. She left space. They sat in silence for a while, and Margaret let the silence be what it was. "You're doing that wrong," Ruth said finally, without looking up. "I haven't started anything yet," Margaret said. "I mean the sitting." Ruth pulled her needle through the fabric. "You're sitting like you're waiting for me to say something. People who wait for me to say something usually want me to talk about my mother, or about how I'm feeling, or some other thing I don't want to discuss." "I'm not waiting for anything," Margaret said. "I'm sitting on a porch at the end of the day, because I'm tired, and it's pleasant, and you were already here." Ruth looked up briefly, back down. "Papa says you kept books for a business," she said. "For 10 years. Did you own it?" "No, my husband owned it." "Where's your husband?" "Gone," Margaret said simply. Ruth was quiet for a moment, her needle moving in and out. "Dead?" "No, just gone." Another silence. Ruth finished a row of stitches and examined them critically. "That's worse than dead," she said quietly. Margaret turned to look at her. "If they're dead, it wasn't their choice," Ruth said, still looking at her mending. "If they left, they decided to." Margaret was very careful about what she said next. "Yes," she said. "You're right about that." Ruth said nothing more. But when she finished the mending 20 minutes later, she folded the dress and set it on the bench between them instead of taking it inside immediately. A small thing, a fraction of an inch of space offered. Margaret didn't make anything of it, just sat beside her until the light was gone and the cold started coming down off the mountains, and then they both went inside. It was on the 9th day that Dodd's man came, not just riding past this time. He came up to the fence on the good horse and sat there until Elias came out of the barn, and Margaret watched from the kitchen window with her hands in bread dough and her eyes very steady. She couldn't hear the words from inside. She read Elias's body instead. The way he stood, feet planted, arms at his sides, which was the posture of a man holding himself very deliberately still, because the alternative was something he'd decided against. The other man talking, Elias not moving. Then Elias saying something short. The man on the horse saying something longer. Elias pointing back toward the road. The man left. Elias came inside and went straight to the basin and washed his hands with more force than washing hands required. "What did he want?" Margaret asked. "Dodd's raising the fee on the water maintenance agreement by 30%. He dried his hands without looking at her. "Effective immediately. Says there's new infrastructure costs." "There's no infrastructure," Margaret said. "I've looked at those accounts." He turned around. "You looked at the accounts." "You left them on the shelf," she said. "I'm a bookkeeper. Looking at accounts is what I do." She met his eyes. "Elias, those water maintenance fees Dodd has been charging you have no corresponding work attached to them. There's no maintenance being done. There's no infrastructure. He's been billing you for nothing for 3 years. The muscle in his jaw moved. "How much?" It wasn't a question, but she answered it like one. $214. He was very still. "He's been doing it in small amounts," she said. "Spread out so it looks like ordinary costs. If you don't sit down and map it against the actual work completed, you'd never catch it." "And you caught it in 9 days. "I caught it in 1 evening," she said, "because I was looking." He turned back to the window. Outside, the mountains were doing what they always did, standing there enormous and unhurried, while everything at their feet tried to resolve itself. "I need to think about what to do with that," he said. "I know." "It can't go to the local magistrate." His voice was flat. "Dodd owns him. Has since before I filed my first claim." "I know that too." "So you're telling me a thing I can't use yet?" "I'm telling you a thing you need to know exists," she said. "And I'm telling you that $214 documented over 3 years in his own billing records is evidence, not for a local magistrate, for a federal land office." He turned back around and looked at her for a long moment. "You're talking about Cheyenne," he said. "I'm talking about Cheyenne," she confirmed. "But not today. Today I'm talking about bread and getting that west fence fixed before the temperature drops another 10 degrees, and what we're going to do about the fact that your youngest daughter appears to believe turnips have feelings." Something moved in his face, the thing that was almost a smile. "She told you about the turnips?" he said. "She has a complete theory about vegetable consciousness," Margaret said. "I found it genuinely compelling." He sat down at the kitchen table, and some of the rigid set went out of his shoulders, and he looked for a moment not like a man carrying a ranch and a legal battle and 2 years of accumulated grief, but just like a tired man sitting in his kitchen. "The biscuits," he said. She looked at him. "Ellen added a pinch of sugar to the dough," he said, and his voice was level, with the practiced levelness she recognized now. "I remembered last night. I don't know why I forgot. She used to say it wasn't enough to taste, just enough to change something you couldn't name." Margaret set down the bread dough. "Just a pinch?" she said. "Just a pinch." She went to the shelf and got the sugar, measured a small amount into her palm, added it to the dough she'd been working, and folded it through without speaking. He watched her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "that I didn't remember before. I should have told you sooner." "You told me when you remembered," she said. "That's all any of us can do."
He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you," he said, and it cost him something to say it. She could hear the cost plainly. Ellen. She had no patience for pretense. She liked people who said what they meant. "From everything you've not said about her," Margaret said carefully, "she seems like she was exactly the kind of woman who deserved better than losing 3 years with her children." His hands came down flat on the table, and he looked at them. "Yes," he said, "she did." Ruth came through the door from outside with muddy boots and a bucket of collected eggs, and she stopped when she saw her father's face and the way he was sitting, and the quality of the silence in the room. And for a moment, the careful armor she wore slipped, and she just looked like a 9-year-old girl who didn't know what to do with her father's grief, any more than he knew what to do with hers. "I got 11 eggs," she said finally. The armor back up, voice steady. "Good," Elias said, and straightened in his chair. "That's good, Ruth." "The brown hen is broody again," Ruth said, setting the bucket on the counter. "She's going to stop laying if she keeps this up." "I'll talk to her," Margaret said. Ruth looked at her. "You can't talk to a hen." "You'd be surprised," Margaret said. "Sit down, Ruth. Wash your hands first. I need someone to show me where your mother kept the extra mixing bowls." Ruth opened her mouth, closed it, washed her hands, pulled out the chair across from her father, and sat down. "Bottom cabinet," she said. "Left side. She kept them wrapped in cloth so they wouldn't chip." "Thank you," Margaret said, and went to find them. Behind her she heard Elias say quietly to his daughter, "How's the south fence holding?" "It needs another post before winter," Ruth said. "Third section from the gate. I'll get to it this weekend." "I can help," Ruth said, and then, a beat later, softer, like it was a question she hadn't meant to ask out loud. "Can I help?" "Yes," her father said. "I'd like that." Margaret unwrapped the mixing bowls and did not turn around. Let them have that moment exactly as it was, undisturbed by being witnessed. 3 days later, she made the biscuits with a pinch of sugar in the dough. She set them on the table at breakfast and said nothing, just poured coffee and got the butter from the cold cupboard and sat down. Clara bit into hers first, because Clara always went first. Her eyes went wide. "Papa," she said. "Papa, these taste like—" She stopped, looked at her father. Something passed between them that Margaret didn't try to interpret. "Yes," Elias said quietly. "They do." Ruth had not touched hers yet. She was looking at it on the plate, and her face was doing something complicated and private that 9-year-olds are not supposed to have to do. Margaret said, "Ruth?" Ruth looked up. "It's all right," Margaret said. "Whatever you feel about it, it's all right." Ruth picked up her biscuit, bit into it, chewed, set it back down on the plate, and looked out the window at the mountains, with her jaw very tight and her gray eyes very bright. She did not cry. She was 9 years old, and she had decided somewhere along the way that she was not going to cry in front of people. And Margaret respected that decision and did not say another word. But she refilled Ruth's coffee cup, the weak coffee she took with too much sugar, without being asked. And Ruth wrapped both hands around it, the way Clara wrapped her hands around things she didn't want to let go of. Outside, hoofbeats in the road, the sound of someone moving with purpose and speed. Elias was at the window before the sound had fully registered, his hand dropping to his belt. 3 riders, coming fast from the direction of Sage Flats. "That's Tommy Reese," Elias said, and his voice had gone to something flat and alert. "Dodd's man. He doesn't ride like that unless something's happened." Margaret stood up from the table. "Girls," she said, and her voice came out with a steadiness she felt somewhere below fear. "Take your breakfast to the back room, please." Ruth looked at her father's face and took her biscuit and her coffee cup and took Clara's hand and went without being asked twice, because Ruth Holt always understood when something was serious.
Margaret moved to stand beside Elias at the window. Tommy Reese pulled up at the fence with his horse lathered and his young face tight with something that was not quite the expression of a man delivering a threat. "Holt," he called out. "I need to talk to you. Just you. Right now." Elias looked at Margaret. "Go," she said. "I'll stay with the girls."
He took his hat from the hook and went out, and Margaret watched from the window with the accounts numbers running quiet and steady in the back of her mind like water finding a level. And she understood with the clean, cold clarity of a woman who had learned to read situations the way other people read weather, that whatever Tommy Reese had come to say, everything was about to get harder before it got better. She had known that was coming. She had known it since the platform in Sage Flats. She went to check on the girls. Ruth was sitting on the edge of the bed, with Clara tucked in against her side, one arm around her sister, with the unconscious protectiveness of long practice. She looked up when Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Is it Dodd?" she asked. "We don't know yet," Margaret said honestly. "It's always Dodd," Ruth said, with the weary certainty of a child who had been watching something bad happen slowly, for long enough that it had become ordinary. Margaret crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from them. She looked at these two girls, this 9-year-old carrying her family, and this 6-year-old, who would be an excellent turnip if given the choice. And she felt the iron thing in her chest that had been there all her life. The thing that had gotten her out of the poorhouse and onto that platform and off it again with her head up, shift into something harder and more purposeful. She had not crossed the country to watch a good man lose what he'd built to a man like Clarence Dodd. She had not survived everything she had survived to sit quietly while someone else's greed ate through a family that had already lost too much. "Listen to me," she said to Ruth. "Both of you." Clara looked up. Ruth's gray eyes met hers. "Whatever happens next," Margaret said, "we are going to be all right. I need you to trust me on that." Ruth looked at her for a long moment with those two old eyes. "Why should we trust you?" she asked. Not unkindly, just honestly. The kind of honest that deserved the same in return. "Because I'm still here," Margaret said, "and I told you I would be." Ruth looked at her sister, back at Margaret. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Quiet and careful and real." Outside, Elias Holt's voice rose once, sharp and sudden, above the sound of the wind. Margaret got up and went back to the window. Tommy Reese was not what Margaret had expected. She had built a picture of him in her mind, from the two words Elias had used, Dodd's man, and from the way Elias had gone to his belt when he heard the hoofbeats. She had expected someone harder, someone with the flat eyes of a person who had made their peace with doing questionable work for reliable pay. What she saw through the window was a young man with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a continuous nervous circle, talking fast and leaning forward on his horse, the way people lean when they're trying to make someone understand something important before they run out of time. Elias was listening with his arms crossed and his face unreadable, listening the way he listened to everything, with his whole body still and his eyes doing all the work. Then he said something short and turned and walked back toward the house. And Tommy Reese sat on his horse at the fence and watched him go with the expression of a man who had just handed over something he couldn't take back. Elias came through the door and closed it behind him. He stood in the main room for a moment without speaking, looking at the floor the way a man looks when he's organizing what he knows into an order he can say out loud. "Tell me," Margaret said. "Dodd filed papers in Laramie yesterday," he said. "Adverse possession claim on the North Quarter. Says my water rights filing has a defect in the original survey. Says the defect makes the filing invalid, and the land reverts to open claim status." How does Tommy Reese know this? Because he's the one who was sent to file them. Elias looked up.
And he didn't. Margaret went still. He rode to Laramie, Elias continued, got to the land office, had the papers in his hand, and he turned around and came back. Why? Elias was quiet for a moment. He says he's been thinking about the things you said to Dodd at the auction, about dishonest men and how long they last. He looked at her. He says he's been thinking about it for 2 weeks. Margaret sat down at the table. She pressed her hands flat against the wood and thought about a 22-year-old boy with a family to feed who had ridden to Laramie with documents that would have destroyed this ranch and had turned around because of something a woman said on an auction platform in Sage Flats. He still works for Dodd, Elias said. Not after today he doesn't, Margaret said. Dodd will know the papers weren't filed. How long before he sends someone else? Tommy says he'll figure it out by tomorrow morning at the latest. He's got another man he uses for legal work, a clerk in Laramie who handles the paperwork when Tommy's not available. Elias pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. So we have tonight. Tonight to do what? That's what I need you to tell me, he said. Because you're the one who understands what those account records mean. And I need to know if they're enough. Margaret was already up and moving to the shelf where she'd put her copy of the figures. She'd written them out on her own paper, separate from his books, organized and dated and cross-referenced against the original billing descriptions. She put the pages on the table between them. Here's what we have, she said, and she kept her voice level because this was the work. This was the thing she knew how to do, and panic was not useful. 3 years of fraudulent billing, small amounts, consistent pattern, designed to be invisible. This alone, taken to a federal land office, opens an investigation into Dodd's practices across every claim he manages in this county. He's not doing this only to you. A man who does this does it everywhere. Elias looked at the figures. His jaw was tight. The water rights survey defect, Margaret continued. Do you have the original filing documents? In the strongbox, in the barn. Get them. He was up and out the door before she finished the sentence. Margaret turned to the backroom doorway. Ruth, she said. Ruth appeared in the doorway immediately, which meant she'd been standing right behind it, which meant she'd heard most of this, which meant she was 9 years old and had been listening to threats to her home with the grim attentiveness of someone who had learned that adults did not always volunteer important information. I need paper, Margaret said. Whatever you have, and your best pen. Ruth disappeared and came back in 45 seconds with a small stack of writing paper and a pen that had been carefully cleaned and capped. She held them out without being asked what they were for. Thank you, Margaret said. Ruth didn't go back to the other room. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her face set in the expression that meant she had decided something. I'm staying, she said. Margaret looked at her. 9 years old. Gray eyes that had been old for at least 3 of those years, standing in the doorway of a house she had been holding together with her hands since she was 6. All right, Margaret said. Then sit down and be useful. Ruth sat. Elias came back with a battered metal box and set it on the table. He worked the lock with a key from his vest pocket and opened it, and Margaret pulled out the land filing documents and spread them flat. She read them the way she read everything, fast and total, looking for the shape of what was there and what wasn't. What's the survey date? She asked without looking up. March of 75, Elias said. And Dodd is claiming a defect in the survey itself, not in the filing, in the survey. She looked up. Who conducted the original survey? Man named Harlan Pierce. He was the county surveyor at the time. Is he still in the county? Died 2 winters ago. Margaret put that aside and kept reading. The survey coordinates are recorded here in the filing. If Dodd is claiming a defect,
He's claiming either that Pierce made an error in the field, or that the coordinates don't match the actual land boundary. She looked at Elias. Have you walked the full boundary of the North Quarter since you filed? Every season. And the markers? All where Pierce put them. So if someone physically went to that land with a proper compass and the coordinates in this document, they could verify the survey is accurate. Yes, Elias said. But the man Dodd will send to Laramie tomorrow will carry a survey that says otherwise. A new survey, his own man's work. Which is why we need to be in Laramie first, Margaret said. The table went quiet. Laramie is 6 hours hard ride, Elias said. I know. The land office opens at 8 in the morning. I know that too. He looked at her. You're talking about leaving tonight. I'm talking about you leaving tonight, she said. With these documents, and my account records, and a signed statement from Tommy Reese about what he was sent to do and why he didn't do it. If he'll give you one. He'll give one, Ruth said from her chair, so quietly and certainly that both adults turned to look at her. I heard what you said about him. He came back. People who come back when they don't have to, they're trying to do the right thing. He'll sign it. Margaret looked at this 9-year-old girl and felt something move in her that was larger and less manageable than she was accustomed to feeling. Yes, she said. I think you're right. Elias was already looking at the window, calculating. She could see him doing it, running the distances and the hours and the risks against each other, with the efficiency of a man who had been making hard calculations for years. If I leave tonight, he said slowly, I leave you here alone, with the girls, and Dodd will know by morning that his papers weren't filed, and he'll want to know why, and the first place he'll look is here. Yes, Margaret said, that's not Elias. She said it with enough weight that he stopped. I need you to hear me very clearly. Those girls need you to get to Laramie. They need you to put these documents in front of a federal land officer and make an official complaint before Dodd's falsified survey gets there first. That is what protects this ranch. That is what protects them. She held his eyes. I will keep your daughters safe tonight. That is my job. Getting to Laramie is yours. He looked at her for a long time. Margaret, he said, and the way he said her name had changed from the careful, formal way he'd been saying it since Sage Flats. It had become something else, something that cost more. I know, she said quietly. Go. He stood up, looked at Ruth. You mind, Margaret, he said. No arguments. I know, Papa, Ruth said. He came around the table and crouched in front of his daughter the same way Margaret had crouched on the platform steps in Sage Flats, getting low, meeting her at her level. He put his hand on the side of her face, this careful man with his scarred hands, and Ruth leaned into it exactly 1 fraction of an inch, which was as much as she was capable of. I'll be back tomorrow night, he said. You keep everyone safe. I always do, Ruth said. He kissed the top of her head and stood up, and went to the back room to say something to Clara that Margaret didn't hear. Then he came back with his coat and his hat and the documents she'd organized into a leather satchel, and he stopped at the door and looked at Margaret. Those account records, he said. There's more than $200 there, isn't there? It wasn't a question. He'd seen the way she'd said it in Sage Flats. The particular flatness of someone reporting a number they've already made their peace with. It opens a larger investigation, she said, into every claim he manages. How many families he's done this to. How many families, he repeated. Yes. He put his hat on,
opened the door. "I'll see you tomorrow evening." "We'll be here," Margaret said. He rode out, and she listened until the hoofbeats faded, and then she stood in the middle of the main room and took a long, quiet breath and turned to face what the night required. Ruth was still at the table, watching her. "What do we do?" Ruth asked. "First," Margaret said, "we check every lock on every window and door. Then we make sure the rifles are where your father keeps them and that I know how to use them." Ruth blinked. "You know how to shoot?" "I know how to learn," Margaret said. "Show me where he keeps them." The rifles were in the cabinet beside the front door, 2 of them, properly maintained and loaded, which she had expected from a man like Elias. Ruth showed her without drama, handling them with the matter-of-fact comfort of a child raised in a working ranch, and she explained the loading mechanism with the precise patience of someone who had watched this done many times and paid attention. Margaret listened and handled the rifle carefully, and found that it was heavier than she'd expected and also less frightening, which was the way of most things you finally picked up and examined. "Does Dodd know you can't shoot?" Ruth asked. "Dodd knows what he saw on that platform in Sage Flats," Margaret said. "A fat woman from Philadelphia with a loud mouth. Men like Dodd see the surface and stop looking." "That's his mistake," Ruth said. "Yes, it is." Margaret set the rifle back where it belonged and checked the window latch on the front. "Clara still asleep?" "She sleeps hard." "Good. Let her." She moved to the next window. "Ruth, I need you to tell me everything you know about Dodd, not what your father has said. What you've seen yourself." Ruth sat on the bench by the wall and thought about it, with the seriousness she brought to everything. "He has 4 men he uses regularly," she said. "Tommy Reese was one. The others are Garrett and Burl and a man everyone calls Pockets because he always has his hands in them. Garrett is the dangerous one. He has a temper and he doesn't get told no. Has he been to this ranch before?" "Once, about a year ago. Papa made him leave." "How?" Ruth's mouth did a small, complicated thing. "Papa came out of the barn with an axe in his hand and told Garrett that the next time he rode onto this property uninvited, he'd leave without his horse." She paused. "Garrett left." Margaret filed this away. "What time does Dodd usually move his men in the morning?" "Not early. He likes his breakfast." Ruth's voice held a child's contempt for a man who had made himself her enemy. "Tommy was the one who came early because he was trying to get here before anyone else was up. So we have until mid-morning at the earliest before anyone comes." "Probably." "Then we're going to sleep," Margaret said. "In shifts. You sleep first and I'll watch, and then you take over at—" "I don't sleep before 10, Ruth said. "Never have." Margaret looked at her. "All right, then we watch together until 10, and then you sleep, and I'll take it from there." Ruth nodded. Then, after a moment's pause, "You're not scared?" It was not a question, it was an observation, and it had a quality of wondering in it. The way people wonder at things they thought would look one way and look another. "I'm scared," Margaret said honestly. "I'm scared and doing what needs doing anyway. That's the only way I know how to be." Ruth looked at her hands in her lap. "Mama was like that," she said quietly. "She never said she was scared, but I could tell. And she always kept going." Margaret sat down beside her, not close. The same distance she'd kept on the porch, the respectful distance of someone who understood that being invited in was different from pushing the door. "She sounds like someone worth being like," she said. Ruth didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. They sat together in the firelight, the woman who had come from Philadelphia with $30 sewn into her underskirt, and the 9-year-old who had been holding a family together with nothing but stubbornness and love. And the night moved around them slow and cold and full of its own sounds. It was past 11 when the horses came. Not one set of hoofbeats, several. Moving without lights, which was itself the answer to every question about what kind of visit this was. Margaret was on her feet before she'd fully registered the sound, the rifle in her hands the way Ruth had shown her, the cold weight of it suddenly purposeful. "Ruth," she said, and her voice came out level. "Back room. Get Clara up and get her quiet and get under the bed. Do not come out unless I call your name. Do you understand me?" Ruth had already moved. She stopped in the doorway. "They'll break the door." "I know." "You can't hold them off alone." "I know that too." Margaret looked at her. "Go." Ruth went. Margaret moved to the window and looked through the gap in the curtain and counted what she could see in the dark. 3 riders pulling up at the fence, maybe a 4th behind. Garrett, she thought, remembering what Ruth had said. Garrett and the others. Dodd had moved faster than she'd expected, which meant Tommy Reese had gone back and told him, or Dodd had another way of knowing, and neither of those options mattered right now. What mattered was the door. She moved to the center of the room and stood with the rifle and thought about everything that had brought her to this particular moment. The poorhouse, the auction platform, the biscuits with a pinch of sugar, the accounts in the wooden box. Ruth's hands folded in her lap in the dark. Clara asking if she was staying forever. The voice that came from outside was not Garrett's. It was Dodd's own voice, smooth as polished wood over the hard thing underneath. "Mrs. Calloway," he called. "I know you're in there. I know Holt is not. I suggest you open this door so we can have a reasonable conversation about a situation that has gotten considerably out of hand." Margaret walked to the door. She did not open it. She put her back flat against the wall beside it, the way a woman does when she has one rifle and the sense God gave her. "Mr. Dodd," she called back, and she was startled by how steady her own voice was. "I'm familiar with what you call a reasonable conversation. I've seen 3 years of it in those account books." A pause outside, longer than she expected. "You've been busy," Dodd said, and now the smooth thing had thinned and the hard thing underneath was more visible. "For a woman who's been here less than 2 weeks. "Numbers don't take long when they're arranged honestly," she said. "What you've been billing this ranch for 3 years has no corresponding work. I have it all documented. Dates, amounts, descriptions, compared line by line against actual maintenance records." She paused. "And I have a signed statement from a young man who was supposed to file adverse possession papers in Laramie yesterday, and decided he'd rather not." The silence outside changed quality. "You're bluffing," Dodd said. "I'm a bookkeeper," Margaret said. "I don't bluff. I document." She heard him speak quietly to the men beside him, too low to catch the words. She heard boots shifting in the dirt. She heard a horse move and resettle. Then she heard something else, hoofbeats on the road, coming from the direction of Sage Flats, fast and deliberate, and more than 2 horses. Dodd heard it too. She knew because he went quiet in the specific way of a man recalculating. The hoofbeats stopped at the fence, and a voice called out, a woman's voice, strong and clear in the dark. "Clarence Dodd." Nora Banks, from the sound of it, with the carrying authority of a woman who had run the only independent business in Sage Flats for 15 years. "I've got 4 men behind me who are very curious about what's happening on the Holt property at this hour. And I've got a letter already written and sealed and addressed to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne that goes out on the first stage tomorrow morning, unless I decide it doesn't need to." Another silence. Longer this time. "Nobody asked for your involvement, Nora," Dodd said, and for the first time there was something strained in his voice. The sound of a man watching the size of the problem expand past what he'd budgeted for. "Nobody asked for your fraudulent billing either," Nora said pleasantly. "And yet here we are." Margaret stood against the wall with the rifle in her hands and felt something she had not let herself feel since she'd arrived at this ranch. Something too fragile to trust before now. She felt the tide turning. She had known in Philadelphia what it felt like when the current ran only one direction, against you, always against you. No matter how hard you worked, or how straight you kept your accounts, or how carefully you stitched your $30 into your underskirt. She had known that feeling for so long it had become ordinary. This was different. This was the moment when the current shifted, and the shifting was almost physical. She could feel it in the room around her, in the changed quality of the silence outside. Dodd said something to his men she couldn't hear. She heard horses moving, the sounds of departure, grudging and slow, but real. Then Dodd's voice one more time, close to the door, aimed at her personally. "This isn't finished, Mrs. Calloway."
"No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it will be." She kept her voice even. "I've documented everything, Mr. Dodd. Every dollar, every date, every false description in every billing record going back 3 years. And when Elias Holt walks out of the federal land office in Laramie tomorrow, it won't just be this ranch's filing that gets examined. It'll be every claim you manage in this county." She heard him breathing on the other side of the door. "Every family you've done this to," she said. "Every dollar you've taken that wasn't yours. All of it documented. All of it already in the hands of people you cannot buy." She heard him walk away. She heard the horses leave. She stood with her back against the wall and the rifle in her hands, and did not move until the sound of hoofbeats had entirely faded, and the night had gone quiet again. The ordinary quiet of wind and distance, and the mountain cold pressing against the windows. Then she set the rifle carefully against the wall and went to the door of the back room and opened it. Clara was wrapped around Ruth's arm with her eyes wide and her face very serious, and Ruth was sitting upright against the wall with her jaw set and her free hand pressed flat against the floor, ready to push herself up at any second. They both looked at Margaret. "It's all right," Margaret said. "They're gone." Clara unclenched from Ruth's arm and scrambled to her feet and crossed the room and wrapped both arms around Margaret's waist as high as she could reach and pressed her face into her side. Margaret put her hand on top of Clara's head. Ruth stood up slowly, brushing off her dress with precise movements, the way she did everything when she was feeling something she didn't want to show. She walked out into the main room and looked at the door and the window and the rifle leaning against the wall. "You held them off," she said. "Nora Banks helped," Margaret said. "I didn't do it alone." Ruth was quiet. Then, "But you didn't run." "No," Margaret said. "I didn't run." Ruth looked at her for a long moment, with those gray eyes that had been old for 3 years and were doing something now that Margaret hadn't seen them do before. Something younger. Something that was slowly and carefully, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time, beginning to come unlocked. "Okay," Ruth said, for the second time. Quiet and real, and meaning something larger than the word itself. Clara tightened her arms around Margaret's waist. Outside, the mountains stood in the dark exactly as they had always stood, patient and enormous, witnessing another small, brave thing that would not make any history book, but would matter absolutely to the people inside the walls of this house. Margaret held Clara and looked at Ruth and waited for the morning. And the morning was coming, and Elias was riding hard toward Laramie, and the documents were in his hands, and the tide had turned. It had turned. Elias Holt did not come back the next evening. Margaret had known, somewhere in the practical part of her mind that never fully went quiet, that it might happen this way. Laramie was 6 hours' hard ride. Land offices had their own pace. Federal processes moved the way rivers moved around large stones, finding their path, taking the time they took. She had known all of this. Knowing it did not make the second evening easy. Clara asked twice before supper where her father was, and Margaret told her he had important business and would be back when he was finished. And Clara accepted this with the trust of a 6-year-old
who had not yet learned that important business sometimes meant something had gone wrong. Ruth did not ask. Ruth sat at the table after supper and worked on her arithmetic the way she always did, with her pencil moving in small, careful strokes, and did not look at the window. But Margaret noticed that she had positioned her chair at an angle that allowed her to see the door in her peripheral vision without appearing to watch it. 9 years old, and already trying not to be caught, hoping. Margaret cleaned the dishes and checked the window latches and said nothing that wasn't necessary, because Ruth's particular kind of pride required the dignity of not being managed. Nora Banks came by mid-morning of the second day with bread she'd baked herself and news she'd gathered from the stage driver who'd passed through Sage Flats at dawn. She was a tall woman, Nora, with the upright carriage of someone who had learned a long time ago that the only way to take up space in a room without apology was to do it deliberately and completely. She set the bread on the table and poured herself coffee without waiting to be invited, which Margaret appreciated, and sat down across from her with the direct ease of a woman who had long since stopped performing comfort she didn't feel. Stage driver says there's a federal marshal riding out of Cheyenne, Nora said. Heading this direction. Word got there faster than I expected. How fast? Margaret asked. 2 days, which means someone in Laramie sent a telegraph the same morning Elias filed. Nora wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. That's not routine processing, Margaret. That's someone in that land office who recognized what they were looking at and took it seriously. Margaret absorbed this. And Dodd? Quiet, Nora said. Too quiet. He hasn't been into his office in Sage Flats since 2 nights ago. His clerk says he's at his ranch house, which is 15 miles east, which is far enough to claim he knew nothing about men riding on the Holt property at night. She looked at Margaret steadily. He's going to say it wasn't him. He's going to say whoever came here was acting without his direction. And Garrett? Garrett left the county yesterday morning. Nora's mouth went thin. Early stage to Rollins. Convenient. Very. Nora set down her cup. How are the girls? Ruth is holding, Margaret said. Clara is fine because Ruth won't let her be otherwise. Nora looked toward the back of the house with an expression that was not pity and not sentiment, but something older and more specific than either. That child has been running on nothing but duty for 3 years, she said quietly. Ruth, not Clara. I know. Ellen was a good woman, Nora said. She'd have hated knowing Ruth had to carry this. I think Ruth knows that, Margaret said. I think that's part of what makes it harder. They sat for a moment with that between them. The particular weight of things you cannot fix, but can only try to ease a little at a time. You did well the other night, Nora said, holding that door. You did well riding out in the dark, Margaret said. I've been waiting for an excuse to say those things to Clarence Dodd for 4 years, Nora said simply. You gave me one. She stood up and smoothed her skirt. The letter I told him was going to Cheyenne. It went. Actual letter, actual federal land office. Names, dates, the billing discrepancies you identified, and a description of what happened 2 nights ago. Signed by me and 3 other business owners in Sage Flats who have been watching Dodd operate for long enough that they had their own things to add. Margaret looked at her. You're not as alone in this as Dodd wanted you to think, Nora said. He cultivated that impression carefully. Isolated families, one at a time, so none of them knew the others were dealing with the same thing. She picked up her hat. That stops now. She left, and Margaret stood in the kitchen for a moment after the sound of her horse faded, feeling something shift in the architecture of the situation, the way things shift when you've been pushing against a wall for a long time, and you suddenly discover there are other people pushing with you. Clara came in from the back room, dragging a rag doll, and climbed into the chair Nora had vacated. Was that Nora? Yes. I like Nora, Clara said. "She smells like bread." "She brought us some," Margaret said, "for supper." "Is Papa coming tonight?" Margaret looked at this 6-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's jaw and felt the familiar tension of telling the child the honest version of a hard truth. "I don't know yet," she said, "but he's coming. It's just a question of when." Clara considered this with great seriousness. "Ruth says when people say they're coming, they always come if they're good people." "Ruth is right."
"Is Papa a good person?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "One of the best I've met." Clara nodded, satisfied, and took her rag doll back to the other room, and Margaret turned to the stove and put the kettle on and tried to quiet the part of her that was listening for hoofbeats. He came back the third evening, an hour before dark, and the sound of his horse in the yard brought Ruth out of the back room so fast she forgot to arrange her face into something careful before she got to the door. She stopped herself at the threshold with visible effort, stood in the doorway instead of running, but her hands had found each other at her waist and were holding on. Elias came through the gate and looked up and saw his daughter standing in the doorway, and his whole face changed into something unguarded and raw that he didn't try to cover. "Hey, Bug," he said. Ruth's composure lasted exactly 3 more seconds. Then she crossed the yard at a dead run and hit him at the waist with both arms, and her face pressed into his coat. And he wrapped his arms around her and held on with his eyes closed and his jaw tight. And for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Margaret stayed in the kitchen. Clara had no such restraint. She burst past Margaret at full speed and attached herself to her father's leg, shouting his name with the uncomplicated joy of a child who had not yet learned to protect herself from wanting things. Margaret put the kettle back on and set the table for supper. By the time Elias came inside, Ruth was restored to her usual composure, which meant her eyes were slightly brighter than normal, and her voice was slightly more controlled than necessary. The overcorrection of someone who had just let more out than she intended. He sat down at the table, and Margaret put coffee in front of him, and looked at his face and read what was there. "Tell me," she said. "The land office in Laramie," he said, "sent a telegraph to Cheyenne within 4 hours of my filing." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Apparently we are not the first complaint about Dodd's practices. We're the 4th. The other 3 came in over the past year from families in the northern part of the county, and the land office had been building a file. What I brought them was the documentation they were missing." "The billing records," Margaret said. "The billing records," he confirmed. "The agent I spoke with said what you put together was the clearest evidence of systematic fraud he'd seen in 12 years. He used the word systematic." Elias looked at her. He said whoever organized those figures knew what they were doing. "She absolutely did," Ruth said from her chair, with quiet authority, as though this point had never been in question. Elias looked at his daughter. Something moved in his expression. Pride, maybe, or something close to it, mixed with the particular softness of a man recognizing his child's character for the first time in a new way. "The federal marshal," Margaret said. "Already in Sage Flats when I passed through on the way home," Elias said. "He had Dodd's clerk in custody this morning. Word is Dodd himself will be taken in for questioning by tomorrow." He paused. "Garrett's run, apparently." "Already gone," Margaret said. 2 days ago." "They'll find him. The marshal says they usually do when there's a fraud case of this size, because men like Garrett know too much to be left running free." Elias drank his coffee. "The adverse possession claim Dodd filed has been suspended pending investigation. My original water rights filing stands. The survey defect he claimed doesn't exist, which I knew, and which a federal surveyor will confirm in the next 30 days. He set down the cup. "The North Quarter is safe." The words settled into the kitchen the way good news settles,
Not loudly, but with weight. The weight of something that had been held up by sheer effort, finally being allowed to rest. Clara, who had been following this conversation with total attention, despite understanding perhaps a third of it, looked at her father and said, "Does that mean we're not moving?" "We're not moving," Elias said. "Good," Clara said firmly, "because Margaret's garden is just starting, and it would be a waste." Elias looked at Margaret over his younger daughter's head. "The turnips," Margaret explained. Something genuine broke across his face then, a real smile, the full kind, the kind that reached everything. And Margaret found herself looking at it longer than was strictly necessary, before she turned back to the stove. Supper that night was the quietest meal they'd had since Margaret arrived. But it was a different kind of quiet from the careful silences of the first week. This was the quiet of people who had been through something together and were sitting on the other side of it, not needing to talk about it, just existing in the same room with the knowledge shared between them. Ruth cleared the table without being asked, which she always did. But she also brought Margaret's cup back refilled, which she hadn't done before, and set it beside her without comment, which was Ruth's specific way of doing something significant while maintaining plausible deniability about its significance. Margaret accepted the cup the same way, no comment, no making it larger than it was, just the thing given and received, and the understanding between them that they both knew what it meant. After the girls had gone to bed, Elias sat across from Margaret at the table with the lamp between them and his hands loose around his empty cup, and the particular quietness of a man who has been alone with something for too long and is figuring out whether to say it out loud. She waited. She had learned the shape of his silences by now. This one was building toward something. "When I was writing to Laramie," he said finally, "I kept thinking about what you said to Dodd, through the door, about every family he'd done this to." He looked at the lamp. "I've been so focused on my own situation, on my own land and my own filing, that I hadn't thought past that. Hadn't thought about who else was out there dealing with the same thing and thinking they were alone." "It's what he wanted," Margaret said. "Isolation is the mechanism. It only works if each person believes they're the only one." "I believed it for 3 years." His voice was even, but she heard the thing underneath it, the anger at himself, the retroactive recognition of having been maneuvered. "I told myself it was just how business worked out here, that Dodd was sharp and I was going to have to outwork him. I never sat down and looked at the numbers, because the numbers felt like one more thing to manage, and I was already managing everything else." "You were managing a ranch and 2 children and grief," Margaret said. "A man can only look at so many things at once." "You looked at everything," he said, "in 9 days." "I came here with nothing but time and the habit of looking," she said. "Those aren't the same as what you were carrying." He turned the empty cup slowly with his hands. "You came here with $30 and more courage than most men I've known," he said quietly. "Don't undersell it." Margaret looked at him across the lamp. "Elias," she said, "what are you trying to say?" He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he put the cup down and looked at her directly, the way he'd looked at her on that auction platform, at her face and not past it. "I signed up with the bride agency for my daughters," he said. "That was the truth when I said it. I needed someone capable, someone who wouldn't break." He paused. "That was true. And it's also not the whole truth, and I think you deserve the whole truth." She waited. "Ellen's been gone 3 years," he said. "And for 3 years, I convinced myself that what I felt toward another woman would be a kind of unfaithfulness, that moving forward meant leaving her behind, that if I built something new, it would mean what we had wasn't enough." He looked at his hands. "I was wrong about that. I know I was wrong. But knowing something and being able to do something about it are 2 different things. and I couldn't do anything about it alone. "And now?" Margaret said. "And now," he said, "you've been in this house for 2 weeks, and my daughters are different. Ruth made you coffee tonight. You understand what that means." "I do," Margaret said softly.
"And Clara thinks turnips have feelings," he said. And there was the smile again, smaller this time, private. "And she's talked about you every single hour of the 3 days I was gone, including when she was telling me about a completely unrelated incident involving the brown hen." Margaret laughed. A real one, the kind that came out before she'd decided to let it. "I'm not good at this," Elias said. "Saying things directly that aren't about cattle or land filings or fence posts. I spent a long time not needing to be good at it." "You're doing fine," Margaret said. "I'm trying to tell you that what started as practical has become something I don't have a practical word for," he said. "And I understand that we've known each other for 2 weeks, and that's not enough time for me to expect anything from you, except what you agreed to in Sage Flats." He met her eyes. "But I wanted you to know what you are to me, what this house has felt like with you in it." Margaret looked at this man with his scarred hands and his silver-touched hair, and his 2 daughters sleeping in the back room. This man who had crossed a crowded square and said 2 words that had changed the direction of her life. She thought about the poorhouse, about the auction platform, about $30 sewn into an underskirt, about the long line of years in which she had been too much for everyone and not enough for anyone. Years in which she had kept going not because she believed something better was waiting, but because stopping was not a thing she was willing to do. She thought about Clara taking her hand on the first day and leading her into the house as though the matter were settled. About Ruth bringing a refilled coffee cup and setting it down without comment. About biscuits with a pinch of sugar that finally tasted like something. "Elias," she said, "I didn't come to Wyoming looking for love. I came looking for honest work and a place where my strength was worth something." She held his eyes. "I found both of those things, and I also found something I hadn't thought to look for." She paused. "I don't know what to call it either, but I know it's real." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same way she had once covered Ruth's hands in the bread dough, the same way Clara wrapped both hands around things she didn't want to let go of. "All right then," he said. "All right," she agreed. They sat like that in the lamplight for a while, not saying anything more, because nothing more needed saying tonight. It was 3 days later that Tommy Reese came to the ranch for the second time. This time he came in daylight, on a horse that was his own rather than one of Dodd's, and he came to the front gate and stopped and took his hat off before he called out, which told Margaret something about what this visit was before she'd even opened the door. Elias was out in the field when he arrived. It was Margaret who walked to the gate. Tommy Reese was younger up close than he'd seemed from the window. 22, she'd been told, but he had the look of someone who'd aged himself with poor choices and was now working out how to stop. He held his hat with both hands and looked at her with the directness of someone who had practiced what he was going to say. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Ma'am, I wanted to come by and apologize properly. Not just for not filing those papers. For the 2 years before that, when I did other things I was asked to do, without asking enough questions about whether I should." Margaret looked at him. "I can't undo any of it," he said. "I know that. But I've given a full statement to the federal marshal. Everything I did for Dodd, every errand, every document, every time I delivered a message to a family that was designed to scare them into selling." His jaw was tight. "I told them all of it, even the parts that put me in a bad light, because it seemed like the only way to do it right." "Will there be charges against you?" Margaret asked. "Possibly. The marshal was honest about that." He met her eyes. "I'd rather face them than keep going the way I was." Margaret studied him for a moment. Young, genuinely ashamed,
carrying the specific weight of someone who had let himself be used for other people's cruelty and is now paying the price of recognizing it clearly. "Do you have work?" she asked. He blinked. "Ma'am?" "Employment. Now that you're no longer working for Dodd, do you have work?" "Not yet," he said carefully. "This ranch needs an additional hand through winter," she said. "Elias has been managing alone for 2 years, with occasional day labor."
The fence on the west side needs a full rebuild. The barn roof has 2 sections that won't last another heavy snow. And there's a spring up on the north quarter that needs to be properly cleared and marked before the freeze. She looked at him. "It's honest work and fair wages, and nobody here will call you Dodd's man after the first week." He stared at her. "Why would you—" "Because you turned around when you didn't have to," she said. "Same reason I'm standing here instead of in a Philadelphia poorhouse." She opened the gate. "Come talk to Elias. The decision's his. But I'll put the question to him if you're willing." Tommy Reese stood for a moment with his hat in his hands and the expression of a young man who has been offered a door he didn't believe existed. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I'm willing." Elias, when she put the question to him that evening after supper, was quiet for longer than she'd expected. He sat with the information the way he sat with hard things, turning it over, examining it from each side, not letting his first reaction be his only one. "He gave a full statement," Elias said finally. "Full," Margaret confirmed, "including things that implicate himself." "And you want to give him work?" "I want to ask you if we can give him work," she said. "It's your ranch." "It's our ranch," he said. The words came out simply, without ceremony, as though they were merely accurate, which they were. Margaret looked at him. "It's our ranch," he repeated. "So we decide together." She had spent 34 years in rooms where decisions were made without her. She had spent 10 years keeping accounts for a business she had no legal standing in. She had spent 8 months in a poorhouse for debts she had not made. She had crossed the country for something different. "Then yes," she said. "I think we give him the work." Elias nodded. "Tell him to come Monday." Ruth, who had once again been sitting within listening distance with her arithmetic, looked up from her paper. "I think it's a good idea," she announced. Both adults looked at her. "He did the right thing when it mattered," Ruth said, with the precision of someone delivering a verdict they've considered carefully. "People who do the right thing when it matters should get another chance." She looked back at her arithmetic. "That's only fair." Elias looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Elias. Neither of them said anything, because neither of them needed to. This was what it felt like when a family was working. Not perfectly, not without friction or difficulty, or the occasional 9-year-old rendering final judgment on adult decisions. But working, actually genuinely working, together. Clara came padding in from the back room in her nightgown, with her rag doll under her arm, and announced that she couldn't sleep because she was thinking about something important. "What is it?" Margaret asked. Clara looked at her with great seriousness. "If we plant more turnips in the spring, do you think the ones we plant now will know them? Like, will they be friends?" Ruth put her pencil down and looked at the ceiling. Elias covered his mouth with his hand. Margaret looked at Clara, this child who believed turnips had feelings, and had decided on the first day that she was staying forever, and had been right about both, and felt the thing in her chest that she still didn't have a full word for settle even deeper. "I think," she said carefully, "that turnips grown in the same ground probably know each other, in whatever way turnips know things." Clara beamed with pure satisfaction. "That's what I thought," she said, and turned and went back to bed. Ruth picked her pencil back up. Elias exhaled slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the pines the way wind moves through things it has moved through for 1,000 years, without knowing
or caring about the small human warmth inside the walls below. But the warmth was there nonetheless, real and growing, and the night held it without comment, the way good country holds things that are worth keeping. Winter came to Thunder Basin, the way it always came to that part of Wyoming, without asking permission and without apology, dropping 6 inches of snow overnight in the first week of November, and following it with a cold that pressed against the windows like something alive and determined. Margaret had prepared for it, the way she prepared for everything, methodically and without drama. The root cellar was stocked. The kitchen garden had yielded its last turnips and kale 2 weeks before the first frost, more than she'd expected, enough to last through February if they were careful. The woodpile Tommy Reese had spent 3 weeks splitting and stacking stood solid along the barn wall, and the west fence was rebuilt and holding, and the barn roof had 2 new sections that would not fail under snow load. She had learned the ranch the way she had learned every set of books she'd ever kept, by paying attention to what was there and what was missing and what connected to what. By November, she knew it the way she knew her own hands. What she had not entirely prepared for was how the snow changed the inside of things. The house became smaller when the world outside went white and quiet. Smaller in the good way, the way a hand closes around something it wants to keep. The 4 of them, and Tommy, who bunked in the barn loft and came in for meals and had proven himself steady and genuinely useful, occupied a space that had once felt too large for what it held, and now felt exactly right. Clara had appointed herself the official documenter of the turnips, which had been brought inside in their preserved form and stored in the root cellar, and she provided regular updates on their status with the seriousness of a scientist reporting to a board of inquiry. Ruth had, over the course of October, begun teaching Clara her letters in the evenings by the fire, which she had undertaken without announcement or fanfare, simply sitting down with her sister one evening and a piece of chalk and a slate, and beginning. Margaret watched this from across the room and said nothing, and felt something enormous and quiet move through her chest. Elias spent the long winter evenings working on things with his hands, mending tack and repairing small tools, and once, over the course of 2 weeks, building a proper bookshelf for the main room, which he set against the wall near the window and said nothing about except that there was room on it for whatever needed keeping. Margaret put her account ledgers on it. Ruth put her arithmetic primer and her reader. Clara put a pine cone she had found particularly significant. It was the most beautiful bookshelf Margaret had ever seen. The letter from the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne arrived on the 14th of November, delivered by a rider who had come through Sage Flats and been redirected north. Elias read it at the table while Margaret stood at the stove and didn't pretend she wasn't watching his face. He read it twice, set it flat on the table, looked at it. Dodd's operation has been suspended pending federal investigation, he said. All billing arrangements he managed on behalf of landowners in this county are under review. Families who are subject to fraudulent charges will be contacted for documentation. He looked up. They're using our records as the template. Your records, Margaret said. Our records, he said, the same way he'd said our ranch, simply and accurately. The investigator's letter says the documentation provided was, and I'm reading directly here, the most methodically organized evidence of systematic land fraud received by this office in a decade of operation. He looked at her. He wants to know if you'd be willing to consult on the review of other families' accounts. Margaret turned from the stove. He's asking me, she said. He's asking you, Elias confirmed, by name. She stood with that for a moment. A federal land office, asking Margaret Calloway by name for her expertise, for the things she had been doing since she was 20 years old and had never once been credited for in any room where credit was distributed. Yes, she said. Tell him yes. Elias was already reaching for paper. Ruth looked up from her arithmetic. "What does consulting mean?" "It means someone needs help understanding numbers," Margaret said, "and they've decided I'm the right person to ask." Ruth considered this. "Because you're good at it."
"Yes. You should charge them properly," Ruth said, with the directness of someone who had watched her father be undercharged by dishonest men for 3 years and had opinions about it. "Don't let them pay you less than it's worth." Elias made a sound that was fully a laugh this time, unguarded and real, and Margaret looked at him across the room and felt the thing in her chest that still didn't have a complete word become a little more complete. The snow deepened through December, and the days shortened to almost nothing, just a few hours of gray light between long darks. And the ranch turned inward, and the 4 of them turned inward with it. Evenings by the fire, meals that took longer than they needed to because no one was in a hurry to stop sitting together. Stories told and argued over and added to. Elias talked about Ellen more easily now. Not every day, not in a way that needed prompting or that cost him the way it had cost him in October. Just sometimes, naturally, the way you mentioned someone who was real and mattered, and is part of what you are. He talked about how she had laughed at her own cooking disasters before she got good at it. How she had a habit of reading 3 books at the same time and getting them confused. How she had wanted a garden and had not lived long enough to see one established. "She would have liked what you did with it," he said one evening. "She would have had opinions about my spacing," Margaret said. "From what you've told me, she had opinions about everything." "Strong ones," he agreed, stated clearly. "Ruth comes by it honestly then," Margaret said. He looked at his daughter across the room, this 9-year-old who had been carrying the family weight and was now, incrementally, day by day, setting some of it down. "Yes," he said softly, "she does." It was on a Sunday in late December that Ruth came to Margaret in the kitchen with something in her hands. Margaret was making bread, the good kind that took the whole morning, and she looked up when she heard Ruth's footsteps stop at the kitchen doorway with the particular quality of stop that meant something deliberate. Ruth was holding a small book, worn at the spine. The cover had a pattern of faded blue flowers. "This was my mother's," Ruth said. "She kept recipes in it." Margaret straightened slowly, her hands still floury. "She didn't write the biscuit recipe down because she said it was the kind of thing you had to learn with your hands," Ruth continued. "But she wrote other things." She looked at the book in her hands and then looked up at Margaret. "I thought maybe you'd want to read them." Margaret looked at this 9-year-old girl, this child who had decided not to need anyone and had been slowly, painfully, honestly changing her mind about that over the past 2 months. This child who had just offered the most significant thing in her possession. She wiped her hands on her apron. "I'd be honored," she said. Ruth crossed the kitchen and held the book out, and Margaret took it with both hands, careful with it, the way you're careful with something that belongs to someone else's history. "You can read it here," Ruth said, "where it's warm." She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat in it with the posture of someone who intended to stay, and picked up the dishcloth from the counter and began folding it with unnecessary precision, which was Ruth's specific way of being present without admitting she wanted to be. Margaret sat down across from her and opened the book. Ellen Holt had written in a clear, practical hand. Recipes, as Ruth had said, but also other things between the recipes. Notes, observations, small moments recorded as though she'd known they mattered and wanted to keep them. The way Clara had looked at her first snowfall. Something funny Ruth had said at age 4 that Ellen had written down word for word with a note that said, "Must not forget this." A description of a morning when Elias had brought her wildflowers for no reason except that they were there, and she was there, and he'd thought she'd like them. Margaret read slowly. She was aware of Ruth across the table, not watching, but present, folding and refolding the dishcloth. "She loved this ranch," Margaret said.
Yes, Ruth said. She was funny, Margaret said, about a note Ellen had written about a particular interaction with a brown hen that had gone badly wrong in a specific way. Ruth's mouth moved, almost a smile. She thought that hen was personally difficult. The hen is personally difficult, Margaret said. She hasn't changed. Ruth did smile then, a real one, small and careful, the way her smiles always were, as though they were precious enough to be rationed, but real. Margaret turned a page and found something that stopped her. It was a short entry, dated 3 years before Ruth had been born, written in the same clear hand, but with an urgency in the pressure of the pen that was different from the rest. I keep thinking about the women who came before me here, the ones nobody wrote down, the ones who crossed impossible distances to places that had no right to ask what they asked, and who stayed anyway, because they were the kind of people who stay. I want to be that kind of person. I want Ruth to see me be that kind of person, so she knows she can be too. So she knows that's what we are, the women in this family. The ones who stay. Margaret read it twice. Then she closed the book gently and set it on the table between herself and Ruth, and looked at this girl, this 9-year-old daughter of Elias Holt, who had stayed when it would have been so much easier to fall apart, who had held a family together with her own hands because that was what she had watched her mother be, and had decided to be too.
"Ruth," she said.
Ruth looked up from the dishcloth. "Your mother wrote something in here that I think you should read," Margaret said, and pushed the book across the table, open to the right page. Ruth looked at it. She read it the way she read everything, completely, her eyes moving with the careful thoroughness of someone taking something in for keeps. And then she read it again. Her jaw went tight. Her hands on the book went very still. "She wrote that before I was born," Ruth said. Her voice was even, precisely, carefully even. "Yes. She was saying what she wanted me to see her be." Ruth's eyes were doing the bright thing they did when she had decided not to cry. "And then she couldn't be here to show me anymore." "She showed you enough," Margaret said quietly. "Ruth, look at what you've done in 3 years. Look at who you are. She showed you exactly enough." Ruth pressed her lips together. 1 breath, 2. "I didn't want to need anyone," she said. The armor was still there, but it had gaps in it now, visible ones, and she wasn't patching them. Because needing someone means they can leave and take the needing with them. And that's the worst part. It's not that they're gone, it's that you still need them, and they can't be there for it. "I know," Margaret said. "Do you?" Ruth looked at her directly. "You keep going. You just keep going. How do you keep going when the thing you needed isn't there?" Margaret looked at this 9-year-old girl, asking the realest question she had ever been asked. "You find other things to need," she said. "Not instead, alongside. You don't stop needing the thing that's gone. You just build around it." She held Ruth's eyes. "The way a tree grows around a wound. It doesn't heal over it. It grows around it and gets bigger, and the wound is still there, but the tree is more than the wound." Ruth looked at her for a long time. "Okay," she said, for the 3rd time. But this one was different from the first 2. The first had been cautious. The second had been the beginning of trust. This one was something else. This one was the door opening all the way. Then she got up from the table and came around to Margaret's side and stood there for a moment. And Margaret turned in her chair to face her, and Ruth put her arms around Margaret's neck and held on with the desperate, compressed strength of a 9-year-old who had not let herself do this for 3 years and was now doing it all at once. Margaret held her, said nothing, let it be as large as it needed to be. Ruth didn't cry. She never cried, but she held on for a long time, and when she finally stepped back, Her face was doing something that was very close to the face of a child who had set something down and discovered her arms were lighter. "Okay," she said, one more time, to herself this time, like a conclusion. She picked up the blue book and went to find her father. Margaret sat in the kitchen with her hands on the table and felt the morning open around her, wide and clean, the way mornings feel when something that has been building for a long time finally resolves. Elias found her there 20 minutes later. He had the look of a man who had just held his older daughter while she cried, finally, for the first time in 3 years, which was the look of a man who had been broken open by something good. He sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. "She showed you the book," he said finally. "She did. Ellen wrote in it every week." He looked at his hands. "I haven't been able to open it since she died. I kept meaning to. He stopped. "She would want Ruth to have it," Margaret said. "She wrote it for Ruth." "I know." He was quiet. "Thank you for what you said to her." "I didn't say anything that wasn't true." "That's what made it matter." He looked up. "Margaret?" She waited. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to know that whatever you answer, nothing between us changes. The ranch is as much yours as mine. You've earned that 10 times over. The girls are—" He stopped. "Ruth is yours, and Clara is yours in every way that matters, and that doesn't change, regardless of what you say." "Elias," she said carefully, "ask me." He reached into his vest pocket and set something on the table between them. Small. A ring. Plain silver, worn smooth, the kind of plain that comes from a long time of being handled, and not from lack of care at the making. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "My mother gave it to me when Ellen and I married, and Ellen wore it for 11 years, and when she died, I put it away because I didn't know what else to do with it." He looked at it. "I took it out the night after you held that door. I've been carrying it since then, trying to figure out when to say this right." Margaret looked at the ring, then at him. "There's no right time, probably," he said. "There's just this time." He met her eyes. "Margaret Calloway, you walked into this ranch 2 months ago with 1 bag and $30 worth of courage, and you rebuilt everything I'd stopped being able to see clearly. You gave my daughters back to me. You gave me back to myself." His voice was steady in the way that costs something. "I would very much like you to stay. Not the way you've been staying, because you agreed to on a platform in Sage Flats, but because you choose to, every day going forward, because you choose it." Margaret looked at this man. She thought about the poorhouse floor in the dark, about the stagecoach and the women who whispered, about standing on a platform in Sage Flats with 9 empty spaces where 9 other women had been, and a crowd of people finding her funny. She thought about the $30 in her underskirt and the particular quality of hope that is not optimism, but is something harder and less comfortable. The hope that is just the refusal to accept that this is all there is. She had refused. She had kept refusing. She had crossed the country on the strength of that refusal, and walked into a town square, and stepped onto a platform, and said out loud that she was still standing here. And a man with calloused hands and 2 grieving daughters had stepped forward and said her. She picked up the ring. It was warm from being carried against his chest. She put it on her own finger and looked at it for a moment. It fit as though it had been made for her hand, which it hadn't been, which meant only that some things find their way to where they belong by routes that no one planned. "I choose it," she said. "Every day, going forward. I choose it." He reached across the table
and covered her hand with his, the ring between his palm and her fingers, warm and certain. "All right then," he said. "All right," she said. From the doorway of the back room, very quietly, came the sound of someone failing to stifle a sound of extreme personal satisfaction. They both looked. Ruth was standing in the doorway, with her arms folded, and the expression of someone who has watched a situation develop over 2 months with great patience and is gratified to see it conclude correctly. Beside her, Clara was vibrating with barely contained excitement, her rag doll clutched to her chest, her eyes enormous. "Clara," Ruth said, with the authority of a 9-year-old who has earned the right to manage a moment, "what do we say?" "We say it's about time," Clara announced at full volume, and then clapped her hands over her mouth because she had not meant to say that quite so loudly. Elias made the sound that was entirely a laugh, helpless and real. The laugh of a man who has been reminded by his 6-year-old that dignity is optional. Margaret laughed too. The real kind. The kind that came up from somewhere deep, and the kitchen filled with it. The sound of people who have been through hard things together and have come out on the other side into something that is not perfect and will not always be easy, but is absolutely, genuinely theirs. Tommy Reese, who had the misfortune of coming in from the barn precisely at that moment for his morning coffee, stopped in the doorway, looked at the room, looked at the ring on Margaret's hand, looked at Clara, who was still covering her mouth, and turned very carefully around and went back to the barn. The snow kept coming through January and February, and the ranch held through all of it. The new roof sections and the restocked cellar and the rebuilt fence doing exactly what they were built to do. The turnips lasted until March, which Margaret considered a personal victory of the first order. The federal investigation into Dodd's operation expanded through the winter, and Margaret spent 4 days in February at the land office in Laramie, reviewing account records for 6 other families in the county, finding the same pattern in each one, the same small and visible thefts adding up over years into something that had quietly eaten through the foundations of working lives. She charged properly. Ruth had been right about that. The families she helped were grateful in the specific way of people who have been told for years that nothing can be done, and have discovered that it can be, that the mechanism for justice exists if you know how to work it, that the numbers tell a story if someone with the skill to read them is willing to look. One woman, older than Margaret, a widow who had been managing a cattle operation alone for 8 years, took her hands at the end of the second day and held them and said, "I thought I was the only one." And Margaret said, "That's exactly what he wanted." And the woman looked at her and said, "You should do this everywhere." Margaret thought about that on the ride back to Thunder Basin with Elias, who had come with her because he said he wasn't leaving his wife in Laramie for 4 days in February, and that was simply not an arrangement he was willing to entertain. She thought about the account books on the shelf he had built, about Ruth's arithmetic primer and Clara's significant pine cone, about the kitchen where biscuits with a pinch of sugar had slowly become the smell of something she had not had since she was young enough to have it the first time. Home. She thought about all the women she hadn't met yet, who were sitting in isolated ranch houses in this territory, believing themselves to be the only ones, and about what it would mean to be the person who showed them they weren't. "You're thinking," Elias said. "I'm always thinking," she said. "You're thinking about something specific," he said. "You've got the look you get when you're running figures." "I'm not running figures," she said. "I'm thinking about what that woman said, about doing this everywhere." He was quiet for a moment. "And?" "And I think she might not be wrong," Margaret said, "about there being a need, about it being something I could do." She looked at him. "Would you mind very much being married to a woman who occasionally goes to Laramie to review fraudulent land accounts?" "I'm already married to that woman," he said. "I married her in December. I just didn't know the full scope of the job description at the time."
"Is that a problem?" "Margaret." He said her name the way he always said it now, with the weight of someone who has learned that a word can hold more than its dictionary definition. "The only problem would be if you didn't do it. If you had this and set it aside." He looked straight ahead at the road. "I want you to be everything you are, all of it, not a managed version of it that fits easier into someone else's idea of what's appropriate." He paused. "My daughters are watching what a woman does with what she has. I want them to see the whole version." Margaret looked at this man and felt the thing in her chest that had been growing since a dusty platform in Sage Flats become so large and complete that it no longer needed a word, because it was simply the shape of her life now, the actual shape of it, the real one, the one that had been waiting at the end of the long road of every hard morning she had gotten through by refusing to stop. She reached over and took his hand on the reins, and he opened his fingers and let her in, and they rode back toward Thunder Basin through the cold, white country, with the mountains holding still around them, the way they always held, patient and enormous, witnessing. Spring came in April with the particular violence of Wyoming springs, mud and melt, and the smell of new things moving through old ground, and the garden returned with the seeds Margaret planted in the beds she'd prepared the previous fall, and Clara crouched beside each emerging row with her rag doll tucked under one arm, and reported the developments with scientific gravity. Ruth turned 10 in May. She asked for a new arithmetic book and a proper lesson on how to manage household accounts. Margaret taught her at the kitchen table over 3 evenings, and by the end, Ruth was doing the monthly tallies herself, with small, careful handwriting and a ferocity of concentration that was entirely her mother's, and entirely her father's, and entirely her own. The blue book with the faded flowers lived on the bookshelf now, between Margaret's account ledger and Ruth's arithmetic primer, exactly where it belonged. Nora Banks came for supper in June and said that 3 more families in the county had been compensated for fraudulent charges, and that Dodd's trial was set for August, and that someone in the territorial capital had begun talking about the need for a proper land rights advocate position for the region, and had mentioned Margaret Calloway's name in that conversation. Margaret absorbed this at the supper table, surrounded by Elias and Ruth and Clara and Tommy Reese, who had stayed through the winter and into the spring because the west fence always needed work, and because no one had told him to go. And because this was, it turned out, the kind of place where a young man who had made poor choices and decided to stop making them could quietly become someone better. "Well," Clara said when Nora had finished, "that's because Margaret is the best at numbers." "She is," Ruth said, simply and completely. Elias looked at Margaret across the table, and she looked back at him, and the whole length of the past year moved between them in that look. The auction platform, and the $30, and the biscuits with a pinch of sugar, and the door held against men in the dark, and the ring warm from being carried, and the bookshelf with its particular collection of necessary things. She had been the woman nobody wanted on a platform in Sage Flats, Wyoming territory, on a dust-thick morning when 9 men had looked at her and looked away, and one man, with calloused hands and 2 daughters, had stepped forward and said her, simply and completely, and changed everything. She had come to this ranch with nothing but the habit of not stopping, and she had built, with these people, in this place, out of honest work and hard winters and biscuits and account books and a 9-year-old girl's slow, precious opening of a locked door, something that no one could bill her for falsely, or remove through fraudulent paperwork, or take from her by any means available to men who only understood what things looked like on the surface. She had built a life that was exactly the size of everything she was. Margaret Calloway Holt looked around the table at her family and understood, with the clean, total certainty of a woman who had finally arrived somewhere after a very long road, that she was not the woman nobody wanted. She was the woman who had been worth fighting for all along. And she had fought for herself, and she had won.